After the funeral, the house felt different, quieter somehow. Even though James had never been a man of many words, they said grief hollowed people out, but James had always seemed hollow in places no one dared to touch. He was the kind of man who could spend an entire afternoon fixing a bicycle without speaking, the kind who baked apple pies from scratch with a precision that spoke of long habits learned in silence. His smiles when they came were small and rare like coins found between couch cushions. His anger was myth. No one alive could say they had ever seen it. Now with Mary gone, there was little left tying James to the modest house at the edge of Willowbrook. The family decided it was time James would move into a retirement home where he could be cared for properly. But James, stubborn even in his frailty, agreed on one condition: that Aiden, his grandson, would be the one to help him sort through the house before he left. Aiden had always admired his grandfather, though he barely understood him. To Aiden, James was a monument, steady, unknowable, built from a past that no one in the family ever fully explained. He had been a war veteran, a father, a widower. He had been everything expected of him, and yet, something in his presence always hinted at a story left untold. The attic was the last place left untouched, and it felt sacred in a way that made even the dust hang heavy in the air. Boxes were stacked in uneven towers, their labels faded into forgetfulness. Aiden climbed the creaking steps with care, feeling the weight of the years pressing down. It was supposed to be a simple task: throw away what was broken, pack what was left. But as he moved aside a broken rocking chair, he saw it, a small, unmarked box tucked into the darkest corner. As if it had been hidden on purpose, the box was heavier than it looked, and if it carried more than just the objects inside. Aiden hesitated for a moment before lifting it, a strange tremor running through his chest, a whisper of something forgotten but not gone. Downstairs, he placed the box on the kitchen table with a gentleness that felt instinctual. James was sitting by the window, his face caught in the last light of the afternoon, looking impossibly far away. Aiden didn't call out. He didn't need to. Some moments carried their own gravity. He opened the box carefully. The smell of old paper and something faintly sweet, dried flowers maybe, rose up, wrapping around him like a memory he had never lived. Inside, beneath layers of cloth yellowed with time, he found a silver ring engraved with two intertwined initials, a bundle of letters tied together with a worn red ribbon, and a single photograph so faded that the faces were almost swallowed by time. But not entirely. The photo showed two young men beneath the sprawling arms of an oak tree, arms slung around each other in a way that left no doubt to anyone who dared to really look. They weren't just friends, they weren't brothers. They were something the world they lived in would have punished them for being. The name Samuel appeared again and again in the letters, each page stained with hurried ink and a tenderness that was almost painful to witness. They spoke of longing, of fear, of stolen moments, and impossible futures. Aiden's heart pounded harder with every word, every line that seemed to scream a truth that had been buried longer than he had been alive. This wasn't just a secret. It was a life hidden in plain sight, locked away because the world had left no other choice. Hands trembling. Aiden closed the box. The attic's dust clung to his clothes, but it was the invisible weight pressing on his chest that he truly felt. He never imagined that the quiet strength he admired in his grandfather had been built not just from survival, but from sacrifice. James hadn't merely lived a life of duty and dignity. He had lived a life of omission, forced to carve out pieces of himself just to be allowed to exist. That evening, Aiden slid the box gently across the kitchen table toward James. Old man's gaze fell upon it, and in that instant, something inside him cracked open. His hand, once steady, even in old age, trembled as he reached for the ribbon, but stopped short as if touching it would unearth a pain too vast to contain. When he spoke, it was not with anger nor with sorrow, but with a weariness older than both. Some things, James rasped, are better left buried. But Aiden could see it now. The grief lodged behind the eyes, the love unspoken yet all-consuming. James hadn't merely chosen silence. Silence had been forced upon him layer by painful layer, until speaking had become an act too dangerous to consider. Aiden sat back, the box still between them, air between them, heavy with the weight of what had always been missing. This wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about shame. It was about truth, and about whether at the end of a life lived in the shadows, that truth still deserved a chance to breathe. Watching the fading figure of the man he thought he knew, Aiden made a vow. He would not let the past stay buried. He would not let love be erased by silence. Because some stories are not meant to die unheard, and some loves are too precious to stay hidden forever. If you believe that every love deserves to be remembered, subscribe to Heart Stories, Real Stories. True Hearts, Voices Finally Set Free. The days that followed were heavy, with a tension that neither Aiden nor James dared to break. The box remained untouched, sitting at the edge of the kitchen table like an unspoken dare. James carried on as if nothing had changed, watering the dying roses outside, fixing the broken latch on the gate, peeling apples in the afternoon light. But the silence between them had shifted. It no longer felt peaceful. It throbbed restless and aching like a wound refusing to close. Aiden, unable to leave it alone, spent his nights reading the letters by the dim light of his desk lamp. Samuel's words unfolded like music, long forgotten, tales of dusty army barracks where glances had to replace kisses, dreams of a life far from the staring eyes of small towns, promises sealed in ink, when voices could not be trusted. Samuel wrote with a rawness that left no room for misinterpretation. He loved James, had loved him enough to imagine a future together, even when reality carved them apart. Some letters hinted at danger. Lines crossed out, words hastily rewritten. Mentions of men in their unit who whispered, who watched too closely, who reported things best left unseen. In one trembling paragraph, Samuel wrote of a threat he had received, a warning that if he didn't straighten out, there would be consequences. Aiden's stomach twisted as he read it. The world James and Samuel had lived in hadn't just been indifferent. It had been cruel, deliberate in its violence against men like them, determined to understand more. Aiden began visiting the town's dusty archive room. He pored over old newspaper clippings, military rosters, casualty lists. It didn't take long to find Samuel's name, but not in a death notice. Instead, it appeared in a short, cryptic article. Local soldier declared missing in action. No body found, no details offered, no ceremony. Samuel had simply vanished. The more Aiden dug, the clearer the picture became. Samuel hadn't died on the battlefield. His disappearance had been suspicious even then. Whispered about in closed circles, but buried under the weight of small-town shame. Some hinted he had deserted others, that he had gotten what he deserved. Aiden saw the pattern with chilling clarity. Men like Samuel were erased not just from history, but from memory itself. The realization left Aiden raw with anger. His grandfather hadn't just been silent out of fear. He had been mourning a love systematically stripped from him, a grief he was never allowed to name. And now, decades later, the town still wore its complicity like an invisible badge, proud and unrepentant. One evening, unable to contain the storm inside him, Aiden returned to the kitchen where James sat alone, the TV flickering softly in the background. Without asking permission, Aiden placed a printed copy of the article on the table. James didn't move for a long time. His eyes remained fixed on the window where twilight stretched its tired fingers across the yard. Finally, with a voice that cracked like dry wood, James spoke. "I loved him," he said so quietly that Aiden almost missed it, "and I left him behind." The confession hung in the air, too heavy to fall. Aiden realized it wasn't just grief his grandfather had carried all these years. It was guilt, the kind that seeps into your bones and reshapes the way you see yourself. The kind that tells you that by surviving, you've betrayed the very thing you loved most. James folded the article carefully, smoothing out every wrinkle as if trying to restore what time had mangled. Then he stood, his shoulders hunched, not from age, but from the unbearable weight of memory. "I promised him," James whispered, "that we would find each other after the war. I was supposed to wait for him by the oak tree." Aiden felt his throat tighten. He could picture it, the lonely oak in the photograph, a silent witness to a promise that history never allowed to be kept. James had waited perhaps for months, perhaps for years, clinging to a hope that Samuel would walk back into his life. But when hope gave way to silence, James did what so many had done. He buried his heart deep enough that even he couldn't hear its cries anymore. That night, Aiden sat alone in his car outside his grandfather's house, hands gripping the steering wheel, until his knuckles went white. He understood now that some stories didn't end because they were finished. They ended because the world refused to let them exist, but Aiden wasn't willing to let this story die a second death. Samuel had deserved to be remembered. James had deserved to love without shame. And if there was still a way to honor what had been stolen from them, Aiden would find it. Even if it meant standing against the silence that generations had built like stone walls around themselves. Because some promises didn't have expiration dates. Some promises waited no matter how many years passed for someone brave enough to keep them. The morning after James's quiet confession, The world outside seemed almost indifferent. The wind rattled the empty swings in the park across the street. The mail truck lumbered past without urgency. And yet for Aiden, everything had shifted. The secret that once lived hidden beneath layers of silence now breathed between them, fragile and trembling, like a bird uncertain if it could survive outside its cage. James moved slower than usual that day, but Aiden noticed something different. A peculiar lightness in his step, as if the weight he had carried for decades had lessened by an ounce. It was barely visible, but Aiden clung to it, knowing how easily it could vanish again. That evening, over 2 mugs of too strong coffee, Aiden unfolded a plan he had stitched together from restless hours lying awake. There would be a remembrance ceremony soon, a gathering for veterans in the town square to honor those who served and those who were lost. What if Aiden proposed carefully? James shared his story there, not hidden behind euphemisms, not reduced to half-truths. The real story, his love, his loss, his survival. James didn't answer at first. His fingers traced the rim of his mug again and again, the lines on his hand, a roadmap of years endured without protest. Finally, he said almost inaudibly, "It's too late for that." Aiden's heart ached, not because he thought James was wrong, but because he knew exactly why his grandfather believed it. Fear had carved itself so deep into James's life that even freedom felt dangerous. Speaking the truth would mean facing not just strangers, but blood children, nieces, nephews, old friends, people who had built their understanding of James on a lie he never wanted but never dared to correct. Aiden didn't push. Instead, he left a small, folded note by James's bedside before he went home that night. It read, "Some wars are fought long after the battlefield is gone. Some victories are still waiting." 2 days later, James called him. His voice was steady but low, like a river running underground. "If I speak," he said, "will you stand with me?" Aiden's yes was the easiest word he had ever said. Preparations began in secret. James wrote and rewrote his speech, sometimes staring for hours at the blank page before writing a single sentence. Aiden helped him find the right words, simple, honest, untouched by bitterness. They practiced in the empty living room, James's voice cracking more often than not, but each time he grew a little stronger, a little clearer. The day of the ceremony arrived with heavy clouds hanging low over the town. At the Veterans Memorial, folding chairs were set up in neat rows, the scent of damp grass rising from the earth. Families gathered, flags fluttered, and the mayor, an old friend of James, shook his hand warmly without knowing the revolution James carried in his pocket. Aiden sat close to the front, heart pounding as names were read aloud. Medals remembered, losses mourned. When James's turn came, he walked slowly to the podium, leaning heavily on his cane. His face was calm, almost serene. He spoke first of duty, of brotherhood, of the sacrifices soldiers made. The crowd nodded along familiar words they had heard every year. But then James paused. He looked at the paper in his hand, then folded it carefully and placed it on the podium. His hands were empty now, his voice bare. "I have another story to tell," he said, voice rough but unwavering. "One not written in the official histories, one that has lived inside me longer than most of you have been alive." Aiden held his breath. James spoke of Samuel. He spoke of secret glances across muddy fields, of whispered promises, under starlit skies, of a love forbidden, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't fit the world's cruel definitions. He spoke of the oak tree where they had promised to meet again, and the endless waiting that followed. At first, the crowd was silent, frozen between shock and discomfort. Some averted their eyes, a few crossed their arms defensively. But others leaned forward, drawn not by scandal, but by the unmistakable ring of something rare, truth spoken without apology. James finished by lifting the silver ring from around his neck, holding it high for all to see. His voice cracked, but he did not falter. "This ring," he said, "is all that remains of the man I loved. I carried it because I had no grave to visit, no name to say out loud. Today I say it, his name was Samuel. And he loved me too." For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then the drama cracked open. From the back row, a man stood up, James's own son, Aiden's father. His face was red with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at James and shouted, "You bring shame to this family. How dare you desecrate this ceremony with your filth?" Gasps rippled through the audience. Some turned away in discomfort. Others stared in horrified fascination. Aiden rose instinctively, placing himself between his father and grandfather, heart racing with fury he barely contained. But James simply stood there, eyes clear, face calm. He didn't answer, he didn't apologize, he didn't explain. For once in his life, he chose not to defend who he was. He let the truth hang in the air untarnished by shame. The mayor stepped up, then placing a firm hand on James's shoulder, nodding solemnly. And for the first time all day, the crowd erupted, not in protest, but in applause. Aiden closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of emotion crashing through him. Against all odds, against all history, James had claimed his life, his love, and his story without asking permission, without shrinking back into silence. Later, when the crowd dispersed and the rain finally broke free from the heavy clouds, James and Aiden stood together under the oak tree in the town square. The same kind of tree Samuel and James had once dreamed beneath. James turned to Aiden, his eyes misty but fierce, and said simply, "It's never too late, is it?" Aiden smiled through the tears, blurring his vision. "Not as long as we're still here." And somewhere in the cool whisper of the rain and the soft bend of the old oak's branches, it felt like Samuel was listening too. The aftermath of James's revelation unfolded not like a storm, but like a slow, grinding earthquake. Invisible to the eye, yet impossible to ignore. Its aftershocks reached into every corner of their family. Some relatives called in anger, others in stunned silence. Aiden's father, furious and humiliated by what he saw as betrayal, cut all contact immediately, warning the rest of the family to do the same if they valued their good name. Aiden watched as invitations were withdrawn, phone calls left unanswered, and old friends turned into polite strangers overnight. But even in the cold vacuum that followed, James seemed lighter. Not happy. No happiness was too simple for the complexity of what he was beginning to feel. It was something deeper, more sacred, a kind of peace he had never dared to imagine for himself. For the first time in his long life, James could walk down Main Street without feeling the crushing weight of pretending to be someone he wasn't still. Aiden worried peace he knew could be fragile, and wounds left to fester for decades did not heal cleanly. One afternoon, weeks after the ceremony, Aiden found James sitting alone on the porch, the box of old letters and the tarnished ring laid carefully on the table beside him. There was a stillness to him that made Aiden's heart tighten. James was staring at a small folded envelope in his hands, one Aiden hadn't seen before. Without looking up, James said quietly, "I found this tucked inside the lining of the box. I must have hidden it from myself so well I forgot it was even there." Curious but cautious, Aiden sat down beside him as James opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter far thinner than the one Samuel had written before. The paper was brittle, the ink faded almost to nothing. But the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. "Samuel." The letter was dated months after Samuel had supposedly gone missing. It spoke of survival, of desperate flight, of a forced departure overseas, orchestrated by Samuel's own family, who saw his love for James as a stain that could only be scrubbed away by exile. Samuel had lived. He had been alive, reaching out across an ocean with the last threads of hope he had left. Aiden felt the world tilt on its axis. James read the letter again and again, each time his eyes clouding with something darker than grief, regret. If he had found this letter back then, if he had dared to believe there was still a future, what might his life have looked like? "He was waiting for me," James whispered, voice breaking in the heavy afternoon air. "And I thought he was dead." Aiden's throat ached with unshed tears. How cruel, how brutally ordinary that a single lost letter could rewrite the course of an entire lifetime. But even as they sat there mourning, what could have been a question began to burn in Aiden's mind. If Samuel had survived, if he had been forced into another life somewhere far away, could his story have continued? Could there be someone somewhere who carried the echoes of that forgotten love? Aiden began digging with a fervor he hadn't known he possessed. He scoured immigration records, combed through passenger lists, traced name changes and distant whispers in dusty archives. It was like chasing a ghost through a labyrinth built by time and shame. Days turned into weeks. Hope flickered and sputtered more than once, but Aiden refused to let the trail go cold. Finally, a breakthrough came from a slim file buried deep in an immigration database. Samuel had arrived in Canada under a new name, granted asylum not for political reasons, but because of the private threats made against him in his hometown. He had married a woman likely for survival rather than love, and built a quiet life in a small town outside Toronto. He had passed away just a few years earlier, leaving behind one daughter and a grandson. The realization struck Aiden like a lightning bolt. Samuel hadn't died in a distant war. He had lived silently enduring the same kind of exile James had faced, only across a different border, and somewhere Samuel's bloodline had survived. Aiden shared the discovery with James, whose face crumpled into an expression too raw for words. It wasn't joy exactly, nor was it sorrow. It was something tangled and holy, the knowledge that Samuel had built a life, however imperfect, however scarred, in the face of every force that had tried to erase him. There was one more piece to this puzzle. Aiden found a record of Samuel's grandson, an artist who lived a few hours away, known for his paintings of landscapes soaked in mist and memory. And something else, a small obituary from a year prior mentioning that this artist had once donated a piece to a veterans' remembrance project in their very town. Aiden's heart hammered in his chest. Samuel's blood. Samuel's memory had already brushed against their lives. Once unnoticed, like a soft ghost, James clutched the silver ring around his neck as Aiden told him. His hands were trembling again, but not from weakness, from something dangerously close to hope. Aiden met his grandfather's gaze and said quietly, "He left pieces of himself behind. Maybe it's not too late to find them." James didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and let a single tear carve its path down the worn landscape of his face. In the distance, clouds gathered once more over the hills, heavy and electric. A new storm was coming. But this time it was a storm of reckoning, not erasure. They had uncovered the truth, but what they chose to do with it would change everything. The drive to the art gallery was lined with golden leaves clinging to the last colors of fall. James sat silently in the passenger seat, the small silver ring tucked carefully into his shirt pocket. Aiden stole glances at him now and then, wondering if the old man's heart could endure the avalanche of what they were about to uncover. The gallery itself was small, almost humble, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore that smelled of dust and forgotten dreams. They arrived early, before the crowds, before the chatter and wine glasses clinking. The walls were lined with muted landscapes, oceans swallowing horizons, forests folding into mist, skies so heavy with rain they seemed to bleed. And then Aiden saw it. Tucked in a corner, almost shyly, hung a painting of a lone oak tree standing defiant against a gray sky. Beneath it, two figures, blurred but unmistakably connected, leaned into each other. It was not signed with a flourish, just a single letter in the corner. S. James moved slowly toward it, as if afraid it would disappear. His fingers brushed the edge of the frame, and for a moment Aiden thought he might collapse under the weight of it all. But James stood straighter, steadier than Aiden had ever seen him. A young man approached them, then a little unsure of himself, dark hair curling at his temples, the same sharp nose Aiden had seen in the old photographs of Samuel. His name tag simply said, "Lucas, are you looking for something in particular?" Lucas asked, his voice kind. James didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply stared at the young man as if time itself had cracked open. Aiden stepped in, his voice thick with emotion he could barely contain. "We're here because of Samuel." Lucas blinked, confusion flickering across his face, then slowly something in his posture shifted. He glanced at the silver ring James held now between trembling fingers. "My grandfather," Lucas whispered almost reverently. For a moment, none of them spoke. 3 generations, 3 broken lines of history stitched back together by a love too stubborn to be erased. Lucas invited them into a small back room, away from the quiet bustle of the gallery. There he pulled out a weathered journal. Samuel's journal, the one thing he had inherited besides a deep love for the things most people overlooked. Mist trees, silent devotion. In the pages, James found words Samuel had written in exile, words that spoke not of bitterness but of hope. Samuel had never truly let go of their dream. He had lived, yes. He had built a different life, yes. But somewhere inside him, the boy under the oak tree had endured. Lucas, too, had grown up sensing a history just out of reach. Stories half told in glances and silences. And now, standing there with James and Aiden, he finally understood why. They spent hours talking, sharing pieces of 2 lives splintered by cruelty and distance, but now finally touching across the impossible stretch of time. Before they left, Lucas handed James a small, folded letter. "He wrote this," Lucas said, "but never sent it. I think he wanted you to have it." James opened it with shaking hands. "I waited by the oak tree. I waited as long as I could. But even if we never meet again, know this, you were loved, you are loved, and nothing, not oceans, not fear, not silence, can ever take that away." The old man wept then, not with regret, but with a gratitude so fierce it seemed to fill the room with light. They left the gallery, not as strangers, but as something more complicated, something deeper, family born, not of blood alone, but of survival, memory, and love that had refused to die. Later, as they sat under a sprawling oak in a park, not unlike the one in the painting, Aiden asked his grandfather if he regretted anything. James smiled, a real smile this time, warm and whole. "I regret waiting so long to live," he said simply. "But I'm glad I didn't wait until it was too late." The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the grass. Somewhere in the hush, between heartbeats, it felt like Samuel was smiling too. And for the first time, Aiden realized some promises are not kept by meeting at the right time or in the right place. Some promises are kept by remembering, by speaking, by daring to bring love back into the light where it always belonged. If you found a forgotten love story hidden in your family, would you dare to finish it? Subscribe to Heart Stories, where true love never fades and every voice, no matter how long silenced, finds its way home.